Academia is more than research output and publications. In this seminar series, we discuss the personal and social aspects of academic work that are not discussed enough. Welcome to Life in Academia.
Hello, everybody, and a very warm welcome to our speaker, Katta Spiel, from the Technical University of Vienna in Austria, where Katta researches marginalized perspectives on technology. More specifically, their work informs design and engineering in critical ways to support the development of technologies that account for the diverse realities they operate in and we live in. I met Katta many moons ago when I was a PhD student, and we both were involved in some conference organization. And one evening, and I still remember everything so clearly about this one evening, I was complaining very loudly about something. And then I noticed Katta was looking at me from across the room, and as Katta was higher up on the academic ladder than I immediately assumed I did a no-no, right? I mean, I very loudly ranted about something that they were involved in organizing. But to my absolute surprise, Katta genuinely cared about my viewpoints and, dare I say, about me. It was such a refreshingly shocking moment for young gazelle that I still remember this interaction to this day. So I am sure I'm not doing Katta nor their work any justice with this introduction, so I will continue to ramble a bit about how excited I am for today's topic. Today's talk will be on being neurodivergent in academia, and Katta will share some of their strategies to conduct academic work, and will shed a bit of light on how to navigate the systems around us differently. I cannot wait for Katta to tell us a bit more and have a lively discussion in the second half of the hour. So please, everybody, join me in welcoming Katta Spiel.
Well, that is quite the build-up. I think I was a student myself back then still, but like barely. I think I defended a week later. Funnily enough, 1 second. So I'm coming to you from a hotel room in Sweden because time planning is not one of my great skills. And then I noticed, oh, it's the week where there are holidays, and also we're not technically in Vienna. So this is happening. But I also have something prepared. There we go. So I'll be, you can see it all. I assume that's it. I'll be talking a bit about how I'm kind of like making it weird, as in how I have to manage to have an academic education and that being in academia while being neurodivergent. The surprise has nothing to do, like, just so you know, surprise has nothing to do with me personally, but like once I realized how much stuff was stacked against people with learning disabilities or coming into academia, I was kind of like surprised that I kind of skirted by in a lot of ways just by, yeah, you'll see. But I do things differently, maybe, I don't know. I don't think they are worth less. And I think we collectively have to rethink a bit what we assume about so-called learning disabilities. Simply because like not so because we have a certain assumption about what learning is and how it looks like, and it's not always the same. And that way, but it follows through in terms of like what research is and what we assume research is, and that follows through. So in that regard, if we kind of like, this has epistemological foundations if we think about that. So in that, I'm going to touch also on how the distinction between what is often called activism and what is called research, and that being opposed things, is not one that does or even can hold for me and many of my peers in the work that we do. That's a privilege of like distinguishing the two. But first, I'm going to tell you something about, you know, how I live or grew up and have my learning journey, so to speak, it's pretty much looking like this. I always assumed that like, people would walk that path, and I always like walk different paths because like I was like distracted maybe, but that's fine. Anyway, I grew up in a rural area and there was really only one school available in Germany. And so they couldn't just like, say I have to go to a different school. That was primary school level. They had to live with me. And I interrupted all the time, all the time. I had so many questions. I was very curious. I wanted to know everything. I interrupted all the time. It was unbearable for the teacher, as as I've been informed. So what they did was letting me read in class. I wasn't really labeled back then with anything specifically. It was a rural area, but like people were just surprised that I never seemed to pay attention because like I literally read in class. But I kind of like had academic success and the marks were fine. And people were like, you never pay attention, but like, what is happening? And I'm like, I was trying to say, this is how I learn, but like I was also 6 to 10. So I was just like, I can't listen to you if I don't read. And then what others then said in my life, so I had that comment quite a lot. If you weren't so lazy, you could have much more potential if you only worked harder. So if I wouldn't read in class, but rather pay my full attention, I would be brilliant. Okay. But like that, like I worked hard. Like people seem to not understand that me reading in class was actually paying attention. And somehow I felt like no one saw that me working hard meant that I didn't look like I was working hard in a conventional system. I then started later studying after doing being the weird one in high school, basically the entire time, because I liked the difficult texts and nobody likes difficult texts. Something in the chat. Okay. No one likes the difficult text. And I was more into, I don't know, the complicated philosophy, and nobody liked that. It was uncool because I like to learn all the things, and nobody in school is cool when they like to learn all the things. So weird. But I started studying then, and I had trouble studying initially, and then I found knitting again. And knitting was the best thing. I knitted all the time. I have so much knitwear. I kind of like give it away for free to people because I would drown in it. But like I cannot follow a lecture really well without doing something next to it. And since I don't want to read a book, because I have learned that that is, also it didn't fly in high school anymore. But like reading a book is not okay. So I started knitting. Knitting is fine. And it was either knitting or being extremely argumentative. So I had this one lecturer who in the first lecture indicated that that was distracting other students and that it was not okay that I was knitting. And I was like, but if I don't knit, it's going to be unbearable for everyone. It's going to be horrible. And not because I want to, but because I will have issues with stopping myself from asking all the questions that I have. And he did not believe me. And then I had one lecture where I didn't do the knitting. And after that lecture, he just came to me and said, please start knitting again. I'm not doing this because I want to be obtuse or anything. Well, it's actually impossible for me to keep that impulse in when I have these kind of questions. Also, I didn't know what was up. I was always trying to explain to people things like, I have a highway in my head and like there are different streams running at the same time. And if I don't have one stream that is kind of like regular by, knitting, which is a very regular activity, the others will just go places and then I cannot hold one of them tight. If I have not one thing where I hold one tight, I cannot hold the others tight. So, but like, yeah, I tried. I had friends and friendships lost because they were annoyed because I got marks that were okay or like passed my studies while playing for hours on the computer, which is true, but that is how I learned. It's so weird. Like I did it while I learned, but also I played the entire time, but I couldn't explain my brain. I remember that in my first perception class, I heard about the cocktail effect, which is, by the way, apparently that some people can filter noises when they are at a party or whatever, and like, focus on the one voice that is towards them. And I was like, that is not a real thing. Who made that up? But apparently it is. But, you know, I have never experienced that. It's just noisy for me. I was just, this is not a thing. Everybody else was like, yeah, this is a thing. And I was just like, anyway, I kind of like, because structuring was becoming complex, because I was also a city council member during parts of my studies. So I created more and more intricate to-do lists because prioritizing is difficult. And I was prioritizing by deadline and to-do list and random rolls of dice. I still do this, though I'm not always using dice. Sometimes I'm using a Python script that is called random rand int 16. So, but you know, I'm getting by, just so. And then during my PhD, and Geraldine is here, maybe she remembers, there was this one time when I really had a breakdown. I was just like, I don't know what's up. I'm doing this one thing all the time. It is literally, you know, frying my brain. I cannot do just one thing at a time. Please give me another job. Geraldine was very nice and gave me another job to do. And half a year later, we figured out that I had ADHD, and I figured that out by the first time hearing people with ADHD speak about their inner fears and processes of recognizing themselves. And I recognized myself, and that was really hard as well, because I mean, I had heard of ADHD, and I have never seen myself in that, because it was just so also tied to not having academic success. But like, while I had academic success, I did struggle. I did struggle to a degree of like, you know, managing other things well, or not being overwhelmed, or even recognizing that I had meltdowns, because I just didn't know what was happening. It was just, everything was too much. And then I yelled at people, and that was not helpful. So I got diagnosed, and that meant for me that, not that I needed the kind of like medical label, but it meant understanding my brain for the first time, and just understanding that I'm not lazy or inconsiderate, just different, maybe a bit weird, but I like that kind of weird. I like being the creative parts of it, and it's kind of a good thing of weird. I'm gonna be open about this, but I do take medication. Meds are rude, because the first time I took some, I was like, what? People just like, you know, think they do things, like they plan to do a thing, and then they just get to do it, and that's it all their life. That is so unfair. I have since scheduled down on them to like find a good balance between, you know, my lovely weird and actually having to function with things and not being overwhelmed all the time. But I also am very happy that I now recognize when I'm overwhelmed before I'm overwhelmed, and can actually, you know, just remove myself from the situation, or find strategies to deal with it that are not just like, you know, having a meltdown. And I feel I do label this as a learning disability, not because I cannot learn or anything, but because there is a learning difference that is not accounted for. And so I'm being disabled in my learning, really, when people do not cater to how that works. I mean, I managed to skirt by. I'm now doing my third study degree. This is not to brag, but it's more like I get distracted and interested in a lot of things. That's fine. But many of my peers do not even get the chance to go to that point. Many of my peers are labeled and sorted out too early because of the stigma that there is a lot of stigma when it comes to ADHD and other learning disabilities that I see. And I see it every time just vanish just a little bit when I disclose to worried parents that I have ADHD as well. And you can really vividly see how they're like, oh, right, okay. And then their worries are just lifted a tiny bit because they're talking to someone with academic success. But it's also so sad that they basically assume that their kid isn't willing or interested to learn when the kid is maybe just like, you know, interested in learning differently. And there's a lot of things that are put in the way of kids with ADHD, at least, to kind of like learn in the ways that open them up with those opportunities that I was afforded, essentially. So yeah. I do want to talk about then about what that has as implications for my work. So in much of my earlier work, I kind of like try to have a dispassionate look, and I try to invoke a bit of objectivity. And then I started doing lit reviews for technologies for neurodivergent folks. And I did the first one, and I did the second one, and then I did the third one, and really they almost broke me. What we see persistently is that, people who are essentially my colleagues are causing active harm on disabled people with their work and their action, and including neurodivergent people. And it's about physical violation of our boundaries, about more implicit mechanisms of dismissal of positions as personal, about tone arguments, but then silencing the well-phrased positions, about the extra labor we put into strategizing and organizing our very presence in the academy, while others just hone their CVs and do, work that is recognized as such, about the work framing as incapable, as burdens to others, as unlovable, as deficient, about organizational structures more focused on a rhetoric of financial issues than willing to make welcoming choices, about the dangers that come from disclosing disability in the job market or generally within academia, like telling people in academia you have a learning disability doesn't fly as well as you might think, even though everyone's highly educated. About the way, then also the ways that ables try to kind of pit us against each other. So there's kind of the good and the bad crib about kind of where it's where it's kind of so I have been called basically what was it, a recognized advocate in the community who has experience in civil discourse. And I was just like, what does that even mean? What is civil discourse? And also it's hilarious because usually the people who are said to me as the unreasonable people tend to be the ones who tell me to tone it down a lot. Because I also complain very loudly, Anyway, and so a bit with Roy Williams and Llewyn Boyd, I ask, what would it mean to discard the fantasy of the modest witness and allow ourselves to authentically occupy a state of what we call passionate witnessing and leverage situated testimony in the shaping of a just world? This is starting now within human-computer interaction, but we seem to have to wade through hateful dispassion that is in turn demanded of us before we can make space for passionate positions. And honestly, I don't have the time, not just because of time blindness, but I'm personally mad and affected by the way we talk about ADHD and neurodivergence. And I kind of needed to stop now. And it's also based on assumptions that take away my own humanity, but also that of my peers. And I mean, of course, such a positionality will affect my research, but so does yours, whatever it is. So again, give me a second. For anyone looking at the watch, this is also my last slide, so we're going to be fine within the timing. But again, so my presence is a bit weird and already troubling, and it's creating this kind of need for activism to survive, and I don't have really the choice. Because also, what would I do with the responsibility of increasing the space otherwise? I am here now. I have kind of skirted by, had that happy accident of doing things I love. But there are so many others who have not been afforded that. So what would I do if I not kind of try to increase the space where others can get there? And some of these actions will always be labeled as activist anyway, whatever I do. And I mean, because simply to a degree, stubbornly sticking with academia is activist for me in and of itself. So I might as well choose to control my resources and to choose how my activism shapes itself. And if the question is not whether I do activism, but how, let me shape the how. And then breaking into boundaries in a personal way allowed me to break into boundaries in an epistemological way. To stay curious of what there might be elsewise that we don't attend to. What other technologies, what other designs could we have? And to find out what might happen if we just take people as, people. And the closer one looks at a boundary, the more it vanishes. So if we ask what activism is, whether it can be a choice, how it differentiates itself from research, What might we find if we're dancing on vanishing lines? So thank you, and let me know what you think.